Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we will be continuing our series of 1e4 for Dummies, where I want to build a repertoire around 1e4, starting at 1000 ELO. That was the last episode, the last two actually. So really just laying out the foundations and the basics of 1e4, just the first couple moves of each major opening. And the way this series works is that we're going to be moving ahead in increments of 200 points. 200 ELO points. I mean, I'm roughly using like chess.com ELO, but today we're going to be going over to the 1200 ELO section. And if you don't know by now, I have three main pillars / like fundamentals, foundations of this series that I will explain right now. So the first one is understanding over memorization. So I want to make it very clear why I'm recommending each and every move in the theoretical section so that you don't have to memorize anything. The second principle is going wide over going deep. So I never want to go too deeply into the variations, at least until we reach like a much higher level, like around 2000 plus. And instead, I want to present you with many possibilities that we have and that our opponent has at each and every step of the way. The third principle is learning from model games. So that is exactly what we did in our last episode. We went over some model games for quite a long time, actually. The episode was like larger than 1 hour. And we went over model games in the main opening. So the Sicilian, the French, the Caro-Kann, so that we can understand different patterns and concepts that we can apply to various different openings and lines. So no matter what our opponent plays, we'll always have some footing and know like what kind of plans we're going for. Today, as you can see by the text there, the maximum depth is going to be of 5 moves. So in the 1000 ELO section, the maximum depth was just the first 3 moves. And today we're still keeping it very short, but as you can see, like the amount of possibilities and lines that appear in the chess variations grow like exponentially. So we'll be covering much more ground today, but we'll only have a maximum depth of 5 moves. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so first let's continue where we left off. So we can start with the Ruy Lopez. If you have questions about the first couple of moves, you can watch the previous videos, but this is the moment where we stopped at the 1000 ELO. So let's take a look at the position. So what do we want with bishop b5? We could have also played bishop c4, of course, the Italian game. But the idea behind the Ruy Lopez, which, by the way, is like my favorite opening in all of chess, the idea is that many times we want to take this knight, which is protecting this pawn on e5, so we want to take it later and then take on e5. But the key word here is later, so we don't want to do it right away. Okay, we'll be going over several of Black's possibilities in this move, but let's start with the most natural one to my eyes for the beginner level, which is knight f6. The infamous Berlin defense. It is infamous because at a very high chess level, like at least 2000 plus, this is known to be very solid and sort of a way for Black to try and make a draw. I mean, again, this is just for the very elite of chess players. For most of us, it's just a normal move. And this reputation comes from already knowing quite a lot of opening lines. So this is natural because the knight is just developing and attacking our central pawn, of course. And I recommend just defending it. So for example, now would be way too early to try and cash in this pawn. There's several problems, even apart from just taking our pawn. The most notable one is this queen d4, which also appears in other lines. So we really shouldn't rush to make this trade. We should just keep our center. And now bishop c5 is the most natural move again. It's actually a pretty good move because you'll notice that when we play d3, now we actually are threatening to take on c6 and take on e5 because now the e4 pawn is protected. And by playing bishop c5, Black very subtly renews this threat, because if we are to take on c6, which is again not great in this position, we will meet a different problem, which is that the knight is hanging as well as the f2 pawn with mate. So this is pretty bad. So instead, I just suggest going c3. And this will take us to the first important plan that we should know in the Ruy Lopez. Also happens quite a lot in the Italian game, which is to build this center with the pawn on c3 and later the pawn coming to d4. Okay? So this is quite important. We will castle next and then probably carry out d3 to d4 at some stage. And we will build a very nice center around that. And we'll take a look at some games later on in the next video where we'll see how to play around this center. So let's look at other alternatives. I gave knight f6 an exclamation mark. I will also make the PGNs available at some point, like putting them on a lichess study probably. A6 is another move that deserves an exclamation mark in the sense that after bishop a4, he's going for knight f6 again. So as you can see, it's pretty similar. And again, at a low level, this really doesn't make the slightest amount of difference, like these move order things. And I mean, some basic move orders make a difference, but like, you know, these lines, did he play the Berlin? Did he play a6 first and then knight f6? You know, it's all way too similar. And I, again, recommend going for d3. So you can see that it will really, it could transpose in most cases. So once again, a6 deserves an exclamation mark in my books, because again, going for this would be rash because of queen d4. So now let's look at moves that are not so, that don't have such a good reputation. And for a good reason, that is. So one is d6, quite common and popular. Now this is just a little bit passive, and it creates this pin that basically just wasn't there before. It Black's willingly created this pin. It's not good to pin your own pieces in general, and we should just strike in the center immediately. So this makes perfect sense, because after this trade, which is sort of forced, we gain more control of the center. And again, Black has this pawn on d6, which is a little bit passive, and that means that the rest of his development will be rather passive. I could show you a couple more moves, but again, the maximum depth for today's video is just a 5. Black should defend this knight, and then we'll carry on with our development. So this d6 move isn't too great. Next, a very interesting move is this f5. I should warn you that, like, for example, from the black side, this is interesting. I've actually played this in a classical game myself against a 2300 opponent, so a FIDE master. But I should warn you to have caution with these kinds of gambits and stuff, because it looks very fun on the surface, but if your opponent knows what he's doing, yeah, he will just gain an advantage and it won't be that fun for you. So the thing about this, you know, these gambits usually contain some amount of venom. The thing about this gambit is that it shouldn't take it. This is called the Jainisch or Schliemann gambit. I think it has 2 names, which is kind of weird. I don't know of many chess openings that have 2 different names. So taking it is not very good, because Black can keep on pushing, and our knight actually finds that because of this queen's diagonal being open, we don't have many squares. We can't go here, we can't go here, and we don't want to go super passive and just go back. Black will just take the whole center. So, like, yeah, we can go for queen e2, pinning this pawn, trying to take it, but Black will just do the same and pin, and again, the knight doesn't find itself particularly happy. So instead, back here, I recommend just going d3. Very simple, very tidy. And for example, Black can trade. And again, we reached our maximum depth, but we're just castling next. And so you might think, okay, if he offered me a pawn, and obviously like he weakened his king as well, quite a lot. And okay, I didn't take it, so he just traded pawns. So what did I gain from this? You know, did his gambit already work out just fine? And the answer is no. This is a very common position for this gambit, still very theoretical, but the point is that later on, when he tries to castle, we'll play bishop c4 and just cut off this diagonal completely. So that's really the disadvantage of moving your f-pawn that early in the game. If your opponent can do something like this, and in this case we will be able to, put the bishop on c4 and prevent black from castling. So this will be pretty good. And I do like white's position quite a lot here. Okay, the next line is this knight d4. I believe this is called the bird's defense, named after a player whose surname was Bird. I don't know what his first name was. Maybe Henry or Harry, not sure. So it's a very funky move, extremely rare from my practice. From what I've seen, extremely rare, especially nowadays. We'll just take it. Black has these double pawns and it'll castle. Okay, right, very natural. And our next move is just going to be c3. So we will be ridding black of his doubled pawns, but in exchange for that, we will take towards the center usually. And again, build up a very nice center later on with d2 to d4, okay? Again, very rare. Okay, the next one, I would say equally rare, is this g6. This again, I mean, you'll notice that these moves that don't fight for the center usually give us a very simple way of playing, like a schematic way of playing, of just castling, going c3 and then d4. So that's why the best moves are really knight f6 here, the Berlin defense, or a6 first and then knight f6, because black forces us to go to defend this pawn, right, to tend to this pawn. So to either go d3 or knight c3. You'll notice that knight c3 is a very natural move, but then that means we can no longer make our plan work of c3 and then d4. So after g6, yeah, we castle, we go c3, and we go d4. So this applies to most lines where black doesn't challenge us in the center. If bishop c5, again, we can castle and go for c3. Bishop c5 is an active move, but at the same time, black has to be wary of the fact that the bishop will just be a target here on c5 very, very early on, and that allows us to do things like this because now our pawn is hanging, but black is not really advised to take it because, yeah, we would go d4, and because black's king is still in the center and we're hitting the bishop and the pawn on e5, like a lot of the tactics will end up favoring us. Okay, let's move on to the next opening. So the Sicilian defense. We won't have much to see today because most like main positions of the Sicilian defense come after like move 5 or 6. Like the starting position of many Sicilian lines begin in move like 5 or 6. So for example, this is one of them. Okay, against all Sicilians, I'm recommending going for the open Sicilian. So our treatment is going to be the same everywhere. If e6, yeah, we just take knight c3 again. Same for d6. We take and we go knight c3. And yeah, in the next lecture, when we move over to the 1400 and then the 1600, eventually we'll start picking up on some theory, some actual theory in the Sicilian defense. It's just sort of the nature of the position that we play these very standard developing moves before we actually start getting some action and having to actively learn some stuff. Okay, let's move on to the French. So here we will see a couple of new things. So d4, d5, knight c3. I'm recommending this against the Caro-Kann as well. Okay, so just to keep it very simple and beginner friendly. So now there's already 3 lines, 3 different directions that black can choose from. So one is knight f6, the most the move that is most in spirit with the French, I would say. So we go e5, knight f d7. You'll notice that like black's development is very awkward at the moment, but black's position is like a spring that wants to like unravel and come to life. So he will go c5. This is mandatory in the French, breaking up white's center, and then knight c6 behind the pawn. And eventually these 2 knights will start creating a lot of pressure on white's center and later with a timely f6, black hopes to just destroy and dismantle white's center completely. Okay, what we'll do is go f4. So this is clever because if we go knight f3, which is I guess the most natural move to an untrained eye, yeah, after c5, this is a sort of situation that we don't want. The only way we would be accepting this is if we would be going for pawn to c3 in this position to keep the center nice and fluid. But with the knight on c3 and now the knight on f3, this just isn't going to work. So instead, what I want to do is go f4 here and then develop the knight behind the pawn. And you'll notice that this pawn on f4 acts as sort of a glue to our center that keeps this pawn alive and healthy. And this one on d4 will be traded at some point, and okay, we'll take with the knight. And since this pawn on f4 holds this one on e5 intact, then this knight on d7 also is rendered slightly useless for the time being. So that is probably the biggest line and most popular of the French. Then we have the win over defense, which is this one. We go e5 because black is threatening to take our pawn. So we go e5, c5, and now you'll notice that we would want to have the pawn on f4 already in this position and develop with something like knight f3 behind it. So again, going knight f3 here would be a mistake after takes, or like even knight c6 first. Again, we would need either a pawn on f4 or a pawn on c3 here to support our center. So black is just going to take here at some point, and this one is just bound to drop off, okay? So instead, what we do is much more clever. We go a3, so taking advantage of what black chose to play, this line with the bishop b4. And now the main line is black taking on c3, and we are able to take back with the pawn, so we artificially sort of, not artificially, but like we managed to get a pawn to arrive on c3, and that will again hold our center together pretty nicely. It's also possible for black to go bishop a5, but as you can see, it's a bit more far-fetched because he's already sacrificing a pawn on c5, which, yeah, black has to take into consideration. Okay, and the next line is d takes e4 here. I mark this as slightly dubious because, I mean, it is a possible line. Definitely not as popular as the other two, but it is possible, so we take it. And the thing about this is that black already is just like accepting sort of a sort of passive position, because you can see that the way he set up his pawns, the pawns are all set up like behind the third rank. It's hard to get this typical break of c5 in because we have some control over that square. And yeah, this opening is just known to be slightly passive. So if black goes knight f6, we just take it. And this will work out well because now black's best move is to take with a pawn, which is not ideal for him. So this whole line with knight f6 is just even more dubious. If he takes with the queen, we'll see on the next lecture that he will run into some problems of the queen actually starting to run out of squares in some variations, and we can even trap it if black doesn't play properly. So better is knight d7. Again, a bit of an awkward move, but he's just preparing knight f6. And after knight f6, now we can just take or remove our knight. Again, we reached move 5, but I will recommend moving our knight away or taking, actually. I have to choose between those lines. I mean, they're both acceptable. On the one hand, black's position, like, since we have more space, this is an interesting concept to talk about. Since we have more space, that means our pieces in general have more squares to go to and more freedom. So we want to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. That's like a general rule of thumb. On the other hand, if we take, we gain a tempo in terms of developing our pieces. So both options are viable. Okay, let's move over to the Caro-Kann. So after knight c3, best by far for black is to take d e4. If you play something like e6, This is really not in the spirit of the Caro-Kann. Okay, so the whole point of the Caro-Kann is to like get the French type of structure, but first get the bishop out, which is the biggest problem in the French, right? So black wants to put the bishop somewhere here and only then close the structure with e6. So a move like e6 here would be very anti-natural, and we can just follow up with just knight f3 and keep on developing. And again, the bishop is just hammed inside the pawn structure, so that doesn't make much sense. So black should take, and now he has a couple of lines. Again, we can see this knight d7 idea, so aiming to play knight f6 without damaging the structure right after the trade. Knight f3, knight f6, and here again I want to recommend this knight g3, keeping more pieces on the board. So it's very similar to what we've seen. Then the old line was bishop f5, attacking the knight, which we move, and then the bishop parks itself on g6. So again, black wants to close the structure in order to develop this bishop on f8, of course, and eventually castle. But he does this in a more sophisticated manner by getting his bishop outside of the pawn chain first. So it's quite an interesting setup for black, but we'll also see some interesting ideas for us, for example, even with some early h4s sometimes, harassing this bishop. Then there's also this modern line with knight f6. So black accepts this slightly crippled pawn structure with the doubled pawns, which favor us in many endgames, for example. And but in return, he will have quite a safe home for his king after he castles. So, you know, it is an interesting way to play. So I recommend this setup here of with pawn to c3, bishop d3, and knight e2. And in order to understand that, it's important to understand why knight f6 right now would not be very accurate, actually. Of course, it's like a normal move. You're not going to lose the game by playing this at all. But it's just a matter of, you know, understanding why the pieces, why theory says that we should place our pieces in different ways, in different structures. So here, because of this pawn on f6, this knight is actually rather restricted. It can go to h4 later on, but you can see that it doesn't have much of a future, and it will need the help of other pieces to even land on f5, for example. So it's a much better route and future for the knight to play c3, first defend this pawn, then bishop d3 behind it, and then knight e2. And behind the bishop, this knight will have some prospects of going to f4 or to g3, and then stir up some play on the king side later on. Okay, so that's it for the Caro-Kann. Let's move over to the Scandinavian. So our moves in the Scandi are actually going to be, are all going to be the same today. So black has three lines here, pretty much. Queen a5, queen d6, and queen d8. Of course, as I mentioned in the last video, like the Scandinavian already is not part of the group of the best openings, right? The best openings by far are the ones that challenge the center in some way, either on the first move or the second one. I mean, I guess that Scandi fulfills the role of defying the center right in the first move, but it has a drawback of bringing the queen out too early. So we kick it away. Okay, let's say the queen goes to a5. Again, we'll be developing in the exact same manner in all lines. Knight f3 and d4. And the interesting part of the theory will only begin after this. But for the first couple of moves, it's always the same. And yeah, from here on out, we'll have to know some differences and nuances about where the queen has moved. But until move 5, it's all the same. And also, I do have to take a look at this line with knight f6 that I pretty much forgot existed. And it's quite popular, actually, at the lower levels. I have some ideas on this, but more on that in the next video. Okay, so instead, let's move over to the Peter's defense, which is 1d6. Again, quite passive, clearly not the best thing black can do, but it's not like bad by any means, it's just slightly passive and dubious, I guess. So we just developed naturally. Now black has two setups to choose from. One is with e5, which is interesting because it's common for more inexperienced players to directly go for this endgame, which is not so great. I mean, at least you have to really play well now, like accurately, and really put turn on the stove in order to put some pressure here with white. But if you don't, if you just assume that the endgame is good because black has placed his king in the center and so on, that's not really true because the queens are off the board, which means black's king will be quite safe. And the knight on c3 is slightly misplaced. Okay, it's kind of a higher depth of a concept, but we would prefer having the pawn on c3, long story short. So instead I'm recommending knight f3. Very natural. Now black has two things he can do. One is taking on d4, which is not like the best because he's giving us full control of the center. This is also a playable line for black, but it's not best. Instead, better is to go knight b d7. And yeah, if we take, like, we don't stand to gain much from this trade because we just opened up black's bishop. We're actually much better off leaving the pawns here because we have a space advantage. So let's just go bishop c4, bishop e7, and that's the end of the line for today. But we will just castle and play in a completely normal routine manner. I mean, this is one of the lines where you can 100% get away, so to speak, without knowing a single bit of theory. So then, instead of e5, black has also the setup with g6. I will also recommend playing in a very conventional and easy way with bishop e2. It's very tame, as you can see, but white will usually get a more comfortable position. I mean, without the usually, like always, if you know a bit of theory that is to come. Instead, bishop c4 would be the way we treat the other line, but this will run into a specific problem, a tactical problem of black going knight takes e4 in the future. This was actually played in an elite game last year of the world champion Gukesh against Arjun Erigaisi. And yeah, Gukesh with the white pieces was like lost in 13 moves or something. This line is just not great for white, so I don't recommend it at all. Oh, I forgot to mention the point is that after we take the knight, black has this fork with d5. And yeah, he's regaining his piece with interest because he has exchanged some pieces, opened up the position for this bishop and so on. And I believe the main line goes like bishop d3 to save the bishop at least. And then black goes for some c5. I think it's like immediately. And he's doing quite well. So bishop e2 is my recommendation. Very simple and easy to learn. Not much about the modern defense because it will most likely transpose to the piece. It's very hard to imagine that black will do without going d6, and we'll just go knight c3 and then bishop e2 and just transpose. So there's nothing new to see here. Instead, when knight c6, this is the Nimzovich defense, I believe. We will take the center, since black has generally gifted it to us. d5 is usually their idea. They can also go e5. Also should look into that, but d5 is usually their idea. We will go e5, take the center, bishop f5, and there are some ideas of related to knight b4, so I just recommend going c3, stopping those annoying things, and after e6, just let's trade off this bishop with bishop d3. So again, the position resembles a Caro-Kann in some ways because black has done this thing of getting the bishop out before closing the structure, but you'll notice that this knight on c6 is just completely misplaced, as we already mentioned a couple times. Black wants to break with c5 in this structure, and so the knight on c6 is just heavily misplaced. Again, not a game-losing difference, but it's just we have to start getting accustomed to the ideal setups for both sides and why they appear, and why things transpire the way they do. Next, let's go to Aliagin's defense. That is one knight f6. Okay, it's sort of a silly defense because black's knight gets kicked all the way around to b6, and you can rightfully think that it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't. But as with all things in chess, if our opponent knows a bit of theory, we also have to know a bit of theory back to make sure we get a good position. Of course, in the 1000, 1200 ELO range, I don't expect your opponents knowing too much theory at all. Maybe just a couple of traps and so on. But yeah, we'll just stick to our fundamentals and learn things bit by bit. So I recommend taking on d6. So another line is going f4. This is much sharper, and you're much more prone. Again, with like trying to hold these overextended centers is very dangerous, even at a high level, I would say. I'm not so confident, and I've looked at these positions many times. This is the so-called four pawns attack. And I'm still not so confident going for these types of positions. So I recommend just taking on d6. And now black can take with usually either this pawn or this one, and we'll look at this in the next lecture. And the last thing I want to look at is 1b6. This is the Owen's defense, I believe. So we take the center, we go knight c3. This is where we left off in the last lecture. Black usually goes e6 in these positions. I mean, it's the most natural way to develop. We go bishop d3. Oh yeah, this is a move that deserves an exclamation mark. So again, it is a matter of like on a higher chess sense, you don't have to always develop your pieces in the same way and just put them on their most natural squares, like at first glance. Like you can think a bit deeper and try to understand where the pieces, if they are better placed in some other square in a given variation. And here is one such case, because we go bishop d3 with the idea that after black's typical bishop b4 move, we go knight e2 instead of knight f3. There's nothing wrong with knight f3, but knight e2 is a bit better. Because, for example, I believe that after knight f3, black will go bishop b4. Now this pawn is hanging. And if we defend it with bishop d3, of course, this setup is very natural. And it is not bad for white in any way. I'm just showing you some ideas, like shedding some light onto why I prefer knight e2. Knight f6 would attack this pawn. Let's say we move it forward, and black is coming in with knight e4. And already putting some sort of annoying pressure on this knight on c3. We don't really want to take it because we would be just giving up a bishop for the knight in an open board, which is not ideal, giving up the bishop pair. Bishop d2 would also give up the bishop pair in another form. So this is a bit annoying. So instead I prefer this move bishop d3 and now knight e2. And if black comes in with knight f6, we are already ready to castle, and we have no problems whatsoever. We are actually much better. Okay guys, so that's it for the video today. Today was just a overview of the theory, again with a maximum depth of 5 moves, aimed at players around the level of 1200, like chess.com, Lichess, whatever you use, but I guess that I'm mainly using for reference chess.com ELO. So that's all for me today, and I'll see you guys with the next video. Have a good week.